whose subjective experience is right? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Is my experience more right than yours? Are you more correct than I am? Now, we live in a world, and we've always lived in a world, where we have opposing subjective experiences. And then they lead to conflict, they lead to confusion, and we find that we can never live in harmony because we have opposing viewpoints. Now, Eastern spirituality focuses on down-regulating or even dissolving these viewpoints, because only then we can meet each other halfway and we can build then real, true harmony in the world. But when we look in the world, that reality doesn't seem anytime soon, apart from us who are engaged actively in spiritual practice, where we are actively trying to remove our subjective viewpoint so that we can allow the world to be as it will. Instead of us having an agenda for the world, we need to get rid of our agenda, and then we can allow the life to be as it will. Now, this is very difficult for a lot of people because they find it hard to get out of their subjective viewpoint. A lot of people have so many opinions and so many beliefs that they just refuse to engage in this spiritual practice. I've noticed over, especially the last few years, that a lot of people say they're on the spiritual path, but then once they start talking about politics, they have a certain political leaning, a certain subjective viewpoint that again has been nurtured by the socialization process that they have had. But then even from that perspective, is your political perspective more correct than the other person's perspective? And that's why I find really comical about politics, where you see opposing views get so mad at each other without realizing we cannot have left without right. It's so simple. It's not rocket science. But from an Eastern perspective, it's still foolish. Even this idea of we can't have left without right, because once we down-regulate or dissolve the ego, our subjective viewpoint of the world, then there is no left and right. It's just as it is. And then once we see the world as it is, we don't have an agenda to impose on others, and we can allow other people to live as they will. Now, if we go back into the Warring States period of China, this was one of Lao Tzu's criticisms of Confucianism, because Confucius himself was actively trying to promote his philosophy for the Chinese people to follow. He was creating an external system so that if you fall out of accord with, you're not following your role to its nth degree. And this is a really silly way of looking at the world, as Lao Tzu said, because Lao Tzu was saying that the Tao cannot be induced. So Confucius was trying to induce the Tao through his own socio-political, economic, religious system, whereas Lao Tzu was saying you need to return to nature because the Tao is naturally there. So you don't need to interfere. This is part of Wu Wei, right? Wu Wei is the path of non-interference as well. You don't need to interfere with life. You only want to interfere with life when you have a subjective viewpoint, or you believe your subjective experience is the number one subjective experience, and you want to promote that all around the world so others can then follow your subjective experience. But that's where the mistakes begin. That's where the conflict begins. That's where the confusion begins. And so all of the Eastern spiritual paths is to try and down-regulate that subjective experience, because that subjective experience thinks in this and that. It cuts the world up according to one's own socialization process, their own ego. And that is a temporary phenomenon that you have learned through the life that you've been living. And that is what eclipses the true nature of the world. So in a lot of the spiritual traditions, they talk about that you need to, in some sense, see the world objectively. To articulate their point, it means not seeing the world in a subjective way, the way that you see it objectively. Everything is one, everything is whole, as opposed to pulling it back into the subjective experience where you experience this and that, and then you formulate your opinions, your beliefs, and your emotions get affected by that incorrect perception, by that subjective viewpoint. Because that subjective viewpoint, as I said, is formulating your beliefs, your perception of the world. And then when someone comes along with a different subjective viewpoint, then that's where your emotions are connected to your beliefs and your opinions about how you think the world is. Now, in a lot of the stories in the East, we find sages and gurus who are not emotional about things that happen in the world. And it's for that reason. It's trying to reinforce that view, that if you have a subjective viewpoint, then you'll be overly emotional, which contributes to conflict and chaos. And we're seeing a lot of this in the modern day, where a lot of people are arguing online. They wouldn't argue offline, because in that sense, they still follow the common etiquette of life. But on the online world, people will argue and say things to people they don't know. And all you're doing is accumulating more karma on a jiva level, on an individualistic level in your persona system. And that karma needs to be resolved. And so if you're online and you're speaking to people a certain way, then, well, you can't then complain about the life that you need to live, because you have to resolve that karma. And if you want to be karma free, then you need to get rid of the subjective experience. And that's the point of the spiritual practice, is to down-regulate that subjective experience and understand truthfully that your subjective experience of reality is not number one. It's not better than anyone else's. It's not something that you should push on other people, but instead, it is something that we need to down-regulate so then that we can really perceive reality as it truly is. And once we all down-regulate our subjective experience, we all see the one reality without differentiation. It's undifferentiated. It's the one state of consciousness that we all have. It's what binds us as one, but we need to get beneath those layers of indoctrination and conditioning to finally see the world not subjectively, but in its true one nature.